Hello one final time, everyone. This is the fifth and yes, final part of our Chapter 26 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. It's also the last section of the last lecture of this entire course. This section is entitled The Reagan Revolution. The focus question for this section is, how did the Reagan presidency affect American aims at home and abroad? Reagan's opponents often underestimated him, basically due to his background in Hollywood as an actor and as the director of the Screen Actors Guild. He was seen as not that politically savvy and not that smart, despite the fact he had been a very successful governor of California during the 1970s. At the time of his election, he was the oldest president ever elected, before the election recently of Biden. However, his optimism and good humor appealed to many Americans, and he actually made conservatism seem progressive. He invoked themes of American freedom as an example to the rest of the world. And he proved to be more of a pragmatist and was successful at controlling the terms of public debate and putting Democrats and liberals on the defensive. When it came to economic policies, Reagan wanted to curtail the power of unions, deregulate industries, and radically reduce taxes. This was termed supply-side economics by proponents and trickle-down economics by critics. The idea was that the more money that those at the top saved, the more money they would have to invest in American business and the economy, including in wages for workers. Now, this turned out to be not as accurate as the proponents of these economic policies thought they would be. And these policies initiated an era of hostility between the federal government and organized labor. And Reaganomics, as these economic policies came to be known, initially produced the most severe recession since the 1930s, between 1981 and 1982. But economic expansion did follow. By the end of Reagan's presidency, ironically and contradictorily, unemployment rates and the gross domestic product were both on the rise. This period saw a considerable rise in economic inequality thanks to Reagan's economic policies. The incomes of most people stagnated or declined, while the top 1% saw a significant increase in wealth. The wealthy did not use those monies saved from Reagan's policies to invest as predicted, and black workers were particularly hurt by deindustrialization and the decline of unions. This ushered in what many historians have deemed the Second Gilded Age, where the top 1% really went at it, and the buying and selling of companies and the consolidation of business into ever larger conglomerations and industries and making business deals was the way to get rich. And what exemplified this new economic outlook was a phenomenon known as the yuppies, or a new breed of young urban professionals that really latched on to these sorts of economic policies and used them as the basis for their political and economic outlook. This period also saw large increases in military spending, which outstripped the federal government's income, producing large budget deficits. However, Reagan remained popular and easily won re-election in 1984. The Reagan administration and conservatives in general saw issues of crime and rampant drug use as two of the most significant social ills in the United States in this period, and they greatly ramped up the war on crime and the war on drugs that was really first initiated by President Nixon in the early 1970s. And Reagan despite his conservative foundations, did strengthen the federal government's role in crime control. He increased spending on law enforcement and expansion of the nation's prisons. He helped pass the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, which reinstated the federal death penalty and instituted mandatory minimum sentencing, which mandated certain sentences for certain crimes and left the sentencing to not up to the discretion of the individual judges on a case-by-case and situational basis as it had been previously done. As a result of these wars on crime and drugs, there was a surge in arrests and a huge expansion of the prison population. And of course, people of color were disproportionately targeted based in statistics showing they were disproportionately involved in drugs and crime. However, meanwhile, drugs, especially cocaine, ran wild among the yuppie set with very little repercussions. When it came to foreign policy issues in the Cold War, Reagan reversed many of the Nixon-era détente approach to foreign policy in dealing with communism and the Soviet Union. And Reagan resumed the Cold Warrior rhetoric and reasserted America as a major military power. He was determined to overturn the Vietnam syndrome by sending troops overseas, but relied mainly on aid for foreign policy goals. And although he opposed totalitarian communists, he continued to assist authoritarian non-communist regimes that allied themselves with the United States against communism and the Soviet Union. And Hollywood got into this Cold Warrior act in this period as well and produced many films that really set the tone for this stark Cold War dynamic of good versus evil. One of the more famous and popular ones was Red Dawn, which is seen, a clip from that is seen in this photograph here. And this movie was basically a speculation about what would happen if the Soviet Union invaded and took over the United States. The biggest scandal of the Reagan presidency was the Iran-Contra affair. Now, this was dealing with two situations, one in Latin America and one in Iran. Congress had banned any sort of aid to the Contras, who were fighting the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. The Sandinistas were a communist-leaning revolutionary force in the country of Nicaragua. And Reagan had approved the secret sale of arms to Iran to secure the release of American hostages in that country. And a system was set up that diverted profits from these sales to buy military supplies for the Contras in defiance of the congressional ban. Once this scandal became public, Reagan denied any knowledge of it, but the affair hurt his administration's reputation. In his second term, Ronald Reagan did soften his Cold War rhetoric, and he established good relations with the new Soviet premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was an advocate for more democratic and capitalistic policies in the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev had two new policies, one called Glasnost and one called Perestroika. Glasnost was the reformation of the Soviet political system along more democratic lines, and Perestroika was the reformation of the Soviet economy along more capitalistic lines. And of course, these two policies very much aligned more with American interests and helped to ease Cold War tensions and led the United States and the Soviet Union to enter into new arms control agreements in attempts to de-escalate those Cold War tensions even further. Because of the Iran-Contra scandal and enormous government budget deficits, thanks in most part to the enormous increase in military spending under the Reagan administration, Reagan left office with a somewhat tarnished reputation. However, he did make conservatism politically popular, and as a result, conservative ideas now dominated the mass media and political debates. In the election of 1988 that pitted Reagan's Vice President George H.W. Bush, or George Bush Sr., versus the Democratic candidate Michael Dukakis, a former governor of Massachusetts, both parties ran negative campaigns against the other. But the Republicans were a little bit more successful at it than the Democrats were, mostly thanks to an ad campaign that highlighted what became known as the Willie Horton affair. Willie Horton was a convicted murderer who Dukakis had allowed to receive a weekend pass to go home and visit with friends and family. And the Bush campaign used this in their rhetoric to accuse Dukakis of being soft on crime. However, there was certainly racial overtones to this as well, because Willie Horton was a black man, and this invoked the racial tensions and the racial fears among many, especially among many in the white population of America. As a result of these efforts and these strategies, George H.W. Bush received a substantial majority in the election of 1988, but the Democrats did manage to retain control of Congress. And there you have it, gang. That concludes part 5 of our chapter 26 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. And that also concludes our lecture for the entire course. I have thoroughly enjoyed having you all in my class this semester. I certainly hoped you learned a lot. As always, keep studying hard, and I hope to see you again.